From the humblest peasant to the richest noble, all dwarves have a love for alcohol that runs so deep that they say they literally need it to get through the working day. Even dwarven vampires, cursed to live off a blood-only diet, have negative thoughts when their affliction has kept them from alcohol for too long. This obsession with alcohol is never really much of a problem in the game. Fields of plump helmets and a still set to repeat usually get set up within the first year. But whenever my dwarves depend on something, there's always a part of me that wants to see how they react when I take it away. Which is why I've spent the past couple weeks forcing my dwarves to drink stagnant cavern well water and sober up. My dwarf's journey to sobriety began before we even embarked, when I got rid of all the alcohol I usually bring in my starter wagon and replaced it with useless extra tools and blocks. This left my dwarves with nothing to drink once we arrived at our destination, which was good for drying them out, but bad for keeping them alive, and so I got them to dig down and establish a well as soon as possible. Once they had water to drink, disaster was officially averted / potentially delayed, and my dwarves could go to work building an actual fortress around the water drinking hub I had designated at the center. While each floor took them longer than the last due to their increasingly severe withdrawals, after a couple years the fortress had a plump helmet farm, for eating only, a full complement of workshops, dormitories, and all the temples and guild halls a dwarf could possibly need. These first years also included our first encounters with the elf, human, and dwarf merchants that each showed up once a year, though I don't think we made the greatest first impression with any of them, because I refused to negotiate, or even let my dwarves out of the fortress, whenever a merchant brought alcohol onto the map. While there was realistically no actual chance for my dwarves to steal a sip of sewer brew while the human merchants weren't looking, I wanted to maintain the ultra-strict prohibition I had going, and you never know when a couple merchants will randomly drop dead and leave their contraband freely available on the ground. This slightly hostile relationship we had with the merchants continued until the beginning of our 4th year, when I finally had a full militia with enough training that their sobriety-induced slow reflexes and attack speed wouldn't be an issue, and I could start enforcing my prohibition by force. My first targets were the human merchants that tried to bring sewer brew, which I'm mostly sure is alcoholic, to the trade depot. Once they arrived, I raised the bridge behind them to trap them inside my fort, and then sent out my militia. One season later, I did the same thing to the dwarven caravan that came to sell us wine and rum, and then 2 seasons after that I did it to the elven caravan, even though they technically didn't have any alcohol on board. I had hoped that by killing the caravans, future merchants would be deterred from trying to trade with me, and while the humans got the message and didn't return, the elves and dwarves were back to visit the next year, which went about as well as they probably should have expected. While the goal of my attacks on the caravans was to stop people from bringing alcohol into my territory, we did unfortunately wind up with a fair few barrels of booze in the process. I obviously didn't want my dwarves touching the stuff, and so I made sure to lock off all the loot as soon as each of the fights was over, but that just meant that we had immovable barrels of booze filling up the trade depot and clogging our entrance, which I wasn't a fan of. My solution was to dig this room down by the Great Magma Sea, where the barrels could be taken and safely locked away in a room that I planned on flooding with magma to celebrate the end of my 5th year in the fortress. There was a small accident before the full 5 years was up, leading to the tragic premature loss of a couple barrels and also a miner, but the persistence of the elves and dwarves in our final year meant that we still had a solid 5 barrels of booze to burn as my dwarves celebrated half a decade of sobriety. As the year ticked over and each barrel went up in flames one by one, I thought back to how my dwarves had coped with the water drinking lifestyle I'd imposed on them. I had more extremely unhappy dwarves in this fortress than I would in an average one, but not nearly as many as I expected, given the mandatory water plus dormitory combo I was subjecting them to. Really, the big increase was in the number of neutral dwarves. My dwarves also moved a lot slower than usual, to the point that I sometimes worried about them dying of dehydration while they were trying to finish a task, but they never did, and it wasn't like I had any real reason to rush while I was building the fortress. And having such a strict stance on alcohol did ruin my relationships with most of the civilizations around me, but only goblins ever bothered to come and siege me. So I'd have to say that while alcohol is important to dwarves, it can pretty easily be unimportant to you. as long as you don't mind sacrificing the happiness and productivity of your dwarves for no real gain. Thanks for watching, an extra thank you to those of you who support me on Patreon, and I'll see you next time.